My golden sister scammed our parents and fled with a con man. I returned to fix the family chaos. My name is Jason. I'm 27. My sister, Victoria, 25, has always been the star of our family. A little domestic genius who's always the center of attention. Imagine, beautiful, smart, adored by our parents. Everything she said was like gospel, and every accomplishment of hers was a remarkable event. Yeah, of course, Victoria could beat anyone at chess, play the piano flawlessly, and somehow manage not to get wet in the rain. And me? I was the one forever living in the shadow of her glory. No matter where I went, I was always the other kid. Guess what? It gets pretty annoying when people only remember you when your sister's not around. Well, things went south when Victoria came back home from college. And of course, she wasn't alone. She had a new boyfriend. Eddie, that's what he called himself. And here's where it gets interesting. She introduced him with so much pomp that you'd think she was about to announce he was the next president. "Mom, Dad, meet Eddie," she said, beaming. I stood off to the side, watching the whole scene, and felt something was off right from the start. Something inside me rang an alarm bell. Yeah, Eddie was ridiculously charming. $1 million smile, a voice so confident that even my dog would have believed him if he said the moon was made of cheese. My parents instantly fell for his charm. They looked at him like he was the long-awaited savior of our little family ship, which had stayed afloat all this time thanks only to their golden daughter. And there I stood, arms crossed, thinking, oh, you guys are heading in the wrong direction. The more I watched this miracle, the more I realized something was off. Eddie was just too smooth, like a slippery fish, too perfect for our family. When he spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that behind his polished words was something unpleasant. You know how some people smile too much and choose their words too perfectly, and you can just sense something's not right? Eddie was exactly that, and I couldn't believe my parents were looking at him like he was another knight in shining armor, missing his fake shine. That day, I kept my mouth shut. I just acted like I didn't care that this stranger had barged into our home and tried not to roll my eyes at every one of his pretentious compliments to Victoria. But inside, frustration was starting to simmer. It was clear to me that this was going to end badly, just because, with my luck, it always does. Gradually, things started getting out of hand. Victoria and Eddie spent more and more time behind the closed door of her room, as if they were plotting a world takeover in there. The door would shut, and all I could hear were muffled voices, Eddie's laughter, and Victoria confidently throwing around words like investment, prospects, and brilliant startups. Honestly, it sounded like nonsense, but my parents listened to her with wide-eyed admiration, as if she was announcing the discovery of a new wonder of the world. My parents started financing their brilliant ideas, though I doubted they even understood where the money was going. It all felt like a circus, with my parents as the naive audience, and Victoria and Eddie the crafty illusionists, pulling money out from right under their noses. At first, it was small amounts for test projects and experiments. But then the stakes began to rise. Every time I saw Victoria telling my parents about her investors, partners, and future filled with success, I wanted to throw up. Seriously, it all looked so fake that I couldn't understand how they even believed this nonsense. But apparently, when you're the golden child, you get forgiven for everything, including utter nonsense. And my parents? They just went with the flow, mesmerized. They laughed at her jokes, nodded at every word, and added, "You're a genius," every other minute. I tried to stop them. "Mom, Dad, do you even hear what she's saying? This is complete nonsense," I told them, but they just brushed me off. "You're just jealous of your sister's talent," my mom snapped, not even looking up from another financial report Victoria had handed over as if it was a contract for launching a space station. "Oh, sure, I'm jealous. Jealous that my sister's draining you of money while I'm still saving up to fix my car." One day, I overheard them talking about selling our family home. Yes, our home. Victoria suddenly started talking about new opportunities, and Eddie nodded like he'd just discovered America. They decided it was a good idea to sell the house to invest in some mega project. Something clicked inside me. This wasn't just their small financial schemes with my parents' money. This was a serious threat. The house was our childhood, our history, and I couldn't stand aside. I burst into the room like a tornado. "What the hell is going on? Are you seriously planning to sell our house for this guy?" I was on the verge of hysterics. But of course, Victoria was ready. Words poured out of her mouth with such coldness that I started to wonder if she even had a heart. "You're just jealous, Jason. You've always been like this, haven't you? Jealous of me because you can't do anything right." She was smiling like a cat that had just caught a mouse. And my parents, my God, they believed her. "This isn't jealousy, Victoria. It's common sense." I tried to explain, but they just took her side. I looked at them, unable to believe my eyes. They, grown adults, were willing to believe every word she said, even if it meant selling everything we had. From that moment on, I knew I wouldn't be able to convince them anymore. Victoria had them wrapped around her finger, and every protest I made only fueled her manipulations. She'd won, this time. But I already knew it wasn't the end. And then, one morning, we woke up, and Victoria and her slippery sidekick Eddie were gone. They'd vanished like two professional magicians, pulling off the greatest trick of their lives. They took everything they could: money, jewelry, the deed to the house, everything that wasn't nailed down. Even the family heirlooms my mother had guarded so closely were probably now gathering dust at the bottom of their suitcases. And my parents, they stood in the middle of the empty house with disbelief in their eyes, like they'd just learned that Santa Claus wasn't real. And of course, instead of facing the seriousness of the situation, my parents began to make excuses. "She's just lost," my mom sighed, as if this was just some small mischief. "She'll find herself. She'll come back," my dad assured, as if Victoria had gone off to summer camp and not stolen everything we had. I stood off to the side, clenching my fists in anger. I wanted to scream, but what would that have changed? I tried to make them understand. "Do you realize what just happened? She stole our money, our documents, the house." I was practically yelling, but all I got in return were vague excuses. "She needs a break," my dad repeated like a mantra, as if that could magically bring back what was stolen. They looked at me like I was insane, as if I was the one to blame for Victoria robbing them blind. Then I suggested the most logical thing. "We need to report this to the police. It's theft." But my parents just waved me off. "We can't do that to our daughter," my mom said, as if we were discussing a minor prank and not a full-on robbery. I didn't know what infuriated me more, the theft itself or the fact that even after everything, they refused to see the truth. The situation became unbearable. I felt like the captain of a sinking ship, trying to save the crew while everyone else calmly blew on the water, hoping it would evaporate. So I made a decision. If my parents couldn't set things right, I would. I couldn't stand by and watch them live in fantasies and justify the unjustifiable. I wasn't ready to just give up. My sister had decided to play a high-stakes game, and I wasn't about to stand on the sidelines. I started my own investigation, because if no one else was going to find the truth, I would. Months passed. No calls, no messages. Victoria seemed to have vanished. The house was filled with silence, and even my parents began to realize that their golden girl had simply conned them. I watched as their optimism slowly melted away, like ice cream in the sun. They sat in the living room, staring at the empty walls where pictures used to hang, and remained silent. It was a sad sight, if not for one thing. They had chosen this fate by closing their eyes to the obvious. I decided enough was enough. If they didn't want to act, I had to take matters into my own hands. I became something no one expected, a family detective. But you know, without the badge and gun, just a relentless stubbornness and a burning desire to get to the bottom of things. I started small, going through all of Victoria's old friends, from her schoolmates she did homework with to the strange acquaintances she picked up after college. They looked at me like I was a crazy brother who couldn't let go of his sister. "Why do you care?" they asked. And I just smirked. "I just want to make sure she's not hiding in some basement with a pile of stolen money." When the old friends turned out to be useless, I moved to the next phase, diving into her social media. That's when the real hunt began. Hours and even nights were spent in front of my laptop, scrolling through her photos, comments, and tagged posts. And you know what? The deeper I dug, the more dirt I found. Eddie wasn't just some charming guy with a dazzling smile. He was a pro in the world of deception. I found old articles and records online, linking his name to several scams. It was like a bad movie. Conman uses gullible women to swindle them out of money. And Victoria was his latest victim. Or maybe not even a victim? My suspicions started to grow. Everything was too smooth, too well planned. Victoria was never a fool, and I couldn't believe she just stumbled into this mess. I found her old tablet in her room, and miraculously, there were still some of her messages with Eddie. They were exchanging plans, discussing schemes, laughing at how easily my parents fell for their con. And that's when it hit me. Victoria knew about Eddie's plans. More than that, she was a part of it. This wasn't just a romance. It was a calculated partnership, and my sister seemed willing to do anything for the promise of a lavish life. I felt something turn inside me. She didn't just run off with a con man. She was his accomplice, his partner, who had sold out our family for the allure of fake prospects. Now I knew. It had become personal. I was digging around online when I stumbled upon photos that made my blood boil. Victoria stood next to Eddie, surrounded by wealthy-looking guys and girls, clearly not from our quiet town. All those faces, smooth, polished, smug. In one photo, Victoria, smiling a smile that could melt ice in Antarctica, held an expensive purse with a yacht in the background. Seriously? A yacht? This was a whole new level of play. And then it dawned on me. She didn't just know about Eddie's scams. She was a part of the whole show. That sweet smile, the fancy clothes, the glamorous parties. Victoria was his full business partner, and she didn't care that our parents were losing their sanity with worry. I stared at those pictures and suddenly realized she wasn't coming back. She didn't care about our family. This whole time, she just used us to buy herself a ticket to a sweet life. I couldn't wait any longer. This wasn't just theft, it was outright betrayal, and I wasn't going to let it go unpunished. I gathered all the evidence I had found, printed photos, screenshots of conversations, bank statements I miraculously dug up from her old laptop. I even found Victoria's old notebook, where she had scribbled some cryptic notes about meetings and deals, and I took all of it to the police. That was the moment when I felt I was finally doing something right. I stood in front of the officer, laying out all the documents on the table. He slowly flipped through the pages, his face growing darker. "Your sister's deeply involved in this," he said, looking up at me, and I just nodded. It was obvious, but hearing it from someone else was a point of no return. And my parents? Well, when I got home, they were sitting there like two wrecked ships. They already knew that Victoria wasn't coming back, that their perfect daughter had abandoned them for quick cash and a fake shine. I looked at them and felt nothing. No anger, no sympathy, just emptiness. All because of their golden daughter, who sold us out for a luxurious life with a con man. There I was, holding all the evidence in my hands, thinking, "Well, Victoria, you wanted to play big? Congrats, you won. But now, dear sister, it's time to pay the price." While the police unraveled their investigation, I went back home, hoping to at least support my parents somehow. But what support? It was a complete mess. Dad turned to alcohol and spent more time with a bottle than with anything real. The kitchen table had become his favorite spot, cluttered with empty bottles, memories of better times, and tears of regret. Mom withdrew into herself entirely. She stopped leaving her room, and if she did, it was only to get a glass of water before vanishing behind the door like a shadow. I tried talking to them, but it was like talking to a brick wall. Every time I mentioned Victoria, my mom started to cry like I just announced the end of the world. Dad, on the other hand, swallowed his anger with another gulp of whiskey, looking at me with the kind of expression that said it was all my fault. "You destroyed everything!" he yelled whenever I suggested we move on. Seriously, I was being blamed for shattering their cute little illusion. I understood that if someone didn't take charge, we'd drown in this swamp of despair. I found a job. Not a super prestigious one, but good enough to help the family climb out of the debts they'd accumulated supporting Victoria's scams, as if that could bring everything back to the way it was. But no, things only got worse. My parents looked at me like a traitor, as if it was my fault I'd pulled them out of their sweet dream and forced them to face reality. Oh, how they hated me for that. "You ruined our hopes," they said. "Why did you tell us everything? Why couldn't you just leave us alone?" They blamed me for being too harsh, too realistic, for robbing them of their last hope. Though honestly, I wanted to scream. "Guys, you chose this damn hole yourselves." I was the one hauling water with a leaky bucket while they just stood by and watched us sink. I tried paying off debts, salvaging what was left, but every step I took only widened the gap between us. They didn't want to hear the truth. They wanted to keep believing in the fairy tale about their perfect daughter. And I, the one who shattered that fairy tale to pieces, became the worst enemy in their eyes. And you know what? Maybe at some point, I stopped trying. Enough. I did everything I could. Their illusions had collapsed, and I was ready to move on. But them? They remained stuck in the past, blaming me because reality turned out to be too cruel. A year went by. My parents, like two broken robots, continued living in that half-empty house, where everything reminded them of the past, of the time when Victoria was their perfect daughter and not a runaway. And then, one day, out of the blue, Victoria showed up on the doorstep. No calls, no warnings, without her trusty con partner, Eddie. She stood in the doorway, alone, exhausted, but still with that familiar confidence that always got on my nerves. She looked like the Victoria I knew, but something in her eyes had changed. Less shine, more fatigue. My parents, of course, lost their minds immediately. They rushed to her as if she were the answer to all their troubles. "Come back home, darling. We'll forgive everything. We'll forget everything," my mom cried, hugging her around the waist as if afraid she'd vanish again. Dad, standing next to her, just nodded, his eyes sparkling with tears, like he was witnessing a miracle. They were drowning in their tears and pleas, as if they were ready to drop to their knees. And me? I stood there, silently watching this circus. I watched as they were ready to swallow all her excuses again, as if the past year and all the suffering didn't matter. But no, this time, I wasn't going to let her get away with it so easily. I stepped forward, cutting through the dramatic scene. Victoria looked at me with surprise, as if she'd seen a ghost. I slowly pulled out the folder with all the evidence I had collected over this time. Photos, documents, screenshots of conversations, everything that connected her and Eddie to their scams. I felt the room fill with silence as I tossed the papers into her hands. "Oh, look, Victoria. Does any of this look familiar? Your little adventures with Eddie, huh?" I said coldly, watching her confident face turn pale. She started to flip through the papers, trying to gauge how much I had on her. "It's all lies!" she yelled, her voice trembling. "You made it all up. It's slander!" She started playing her favorite game, blaming me, trying to wriggle out of it. But this time, it was different. My parents, the very same parents who always took her side, suddenly turned their heads toward me. They looked at the papers, at Victoria, and then at me, as if they were trying to piece together a puzzle that hadn't made sense for a whole year. "Is it true, Victoria?" my dad asked, his voice shaking, and I could see the realization dawning in his eyes that everything I'd said was the truth. She tried to make excuses, started to spin stories, accuse me of wanting to destroy her. But this time, no one believed her. I stepped forward, feeling cold anger fill me. "No, Victoria. You destroyed all of us." Victoria was arrested right there on our doorstep. Honestly, it felt like a scene from a bad detective movie. First flashing lights, then cops in dark uniforms with grim faces, and then the click of handcuffs I'll never forget. She stood there, with a mixture of shock and despair frozen on her face, trying to explain, to justify, but her words didn't matter anymore. Victoria, the perfect daughter who could get out of any situation, was finally caught. And you know what? It felt damn good to watch. My parents stood there like two statues, unable to move. Their illusion had collapsed like a house of cards, They finally realized that their precious Victoria wasn't some innocent victim, but just as much of a fraudster as her partner, Eddie. I saw my mom trying to understand how it had all gone so wrong, how things had gotten so out of hand. Dad, looking like a broken man, stood with a hollow gaze, his hands hanging limp, as if he'd just learned his whole world was a lie. It ended quickly. Victoria was taken away, and the house was plunged into silence once more. My parents, thinking there was still hope, started a legal battle, trying to recover at least some of the stolen money. But it was too late. Most of the money had vanished into thin air, and the whole endeavor was a waste of time and nerves. All of Victoria's business ideas, all her promises of success, it was all smoke and mirrors, and my parents finally saw it in full. And me? I was left alone in this shattered family. The once cozy house now felt empty, cold, and I wandered through its rooms, feeling like I'd finally broken free. You know that feeling? When you're free from a burden you've carried for years, and you can finally breathe freely. That's exactly what it was. I was free from their expectations, from their manipulations, from their endless illusions. I looked at my parents and knew they could no longer hold me captive in their fantasies. They had lost everything they'd fought for, and I had finally gained what I'd needed so desperately. Freedom. Victoria had paid for her actions, and now, for the first time in years, I felt like the master of my own life. I swore to myself that I would never get involved in other people's games again. That I would build my own life, without lies, without deception, and without people who are ready to sell you out for their own comfort. This house was no longer my home, and my parents were no longer my family. I started packing my things, collecting everything that mattered to me, and with each box I packed, I felt the past slipping away. Now, there was only me. And that was the best thing that could have happened.